Cuba has a rich and complex history that spans over 5 centuries. Here is a brief overview of the key events and periods in Cuban history. Pre-Columbian era, before the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492, the island of Cuba was inhabited by various indigenous peoples, including the Taino and Cibone. These indigenous communities lived in small agrarian societies. Spanish colonial rule. In 1492, Christopher Columbus arrived in Cuba during his first voyage to the Americas. The Spanish quickly established colonial rule over the island, leading to the exploitation of indigenous populations and the introduction of African slaves to work on sugar plantations. Cuba became a key hub for Spanish trade in the Caribbean. Sugar plantations and slavery. By the 18th century, Cuba had become one of the world's largest sugar producers, with a plantation-based economy heavily reliant on African slave labor. The African population grew significantly, and cultural influences from Africa became an integral part of Cuban society. Independence struggles. In the 19th century, Cuban nationalism grew, fueled by a desire for independence from Spanish colonial rule. Several uprisings and wars of independence took place, including the 10 Years' War, 1868 to 1878, and the Cuban War of Independence, 1895 to 1898. The latter conflict was supported by figures such as José Martí and resulted in U.S. intervention. U.S. occupation and independence. Following the Spanish-American War in 1898, the United States gained control over Cuba. The U.S. occupation lasted until 1902, when Cuba achieved formal independence, albeit with certain restrictions imposed by the Platt Amendment, which allowed for U.S. intervention in Cuban affairs. The Republic and political instability. The early 20th century in Cuba was marked by political instability, corruption, and economic inequality. The Cuban government frequently changed hands, and authoritarian leaders such as Gerardo Machado and Fulgencio Batista ruled the country. During this time, organized crime, particularly with ties to the United States, thrived in Cuba. The Cuban Revolution. In 1959, Fidel Castro, along with his revolutionary movement, successfully overthrew the Batista regime. The Cuban Revolution established a socialist government and implemented widespread social and economic reforms. Cuba's alliance with the Soviet Union and its adoption of Marxist-Leninist ideology strained relations with the United States, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Socialist Cuba and Cold War era. Under Castro's leadership, Cuba embraced socialism, nationalized industries, and implemented collectivization policies. Cuba became a key ally of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, receiving economic and military support. The U.S. imposed an economic embargo on Cuba, isolating the country from much of the international community. Post-Soviet era and economic challenges. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Cuba faced a severe economic crisis known as the Special Period. The loss of Soviet subsidies led to widespread shortages of basic goods and a decline in living standards. Cuba implemented limited market-oriented reforms to alleviate the crisis while maintaining its socialist system. Recent developments. In 2008, Fidel Castro stepped down due to health issues, and his brother Raúl Castro assumed power. In 2014, the United States and Cuba began to normalize diplomatic relations, leading to the easing of some trade and travel restrictions. In 2018, Raúl Castro handed over the presidency to Miguel Díaz-Canel, marking the first non-Castro president in Cuba since the revolution. Cuba continues to face economic challenges, political restrictions, and debates over its socialist system. However, it remains a unique and culturally vibrant nation with a distinct history and identity.